Welcome to The Road to Jesus with Pastor Fred here at St. James Lutheran Church in Marion, Indiana. Today we are covering Nehemiah, chapter 10 to the end of it, which is just a few chapters. And then we're going to cover the entire book of Esther, and then we're going to go up to chapter 10 of the book of Job. Now, Esther gets caught in the middle here, but I think it's the most interesting of the three books that we have here. In Nehemiah 10, starting off, the people make promises to God that they will not again intermarry with the people of the land. Remember, that was a problem before. And they will also not buy or sell on the Sabbath. The violation of the Sabbath was something that plagued Israel throughout its history. It was something that always made God angry at them, and they continually did. And so they make that promise now that they're back from exile, they're not going to do it. And they also promised to give offerings of money and to give the first fruits of their land to God, which is what was part of the covenant. So this is all the result of Ezra and Nehemiah getting the people back to worshiping God the right way and getting them back in line with God's word. Now the writer spends the next several chapters listing all the people and all the various jobs they have, that we're familiar with that going through Chronicles. And then he talks about some final reforms concerning reinstating God's ban on the Moabites, that they were not allowed to enter the temple area. They kept on fudging on that, and God said, no, when I said the Moabites weren't to enter because of their evilness, they're not to enter. That moves us on to the book of Esther. Now, the book of Esther, remember, happens during the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. It happens after the temple's been rebuilt, but before the walls of Jerusalem are rebuilt. So it happens during that time period. The difference is that the book of Esther happens in Babylon, or what has now become Persia, during Esther's time, where the Jews were in exile. So the Jews had settled down in the area, and many of them were living very productive lives and had become a part of that nation. They were Jews, but they had no desire to ever return to Judah or Jerusalem. Most of them were young enough that they had no memory of Judah. Even though they were Jewish, it was a foreign land to them. Babylon Susa was the only home they had ever known. Now, we see cases like this in our own country, where, for instance, a family will come illegally into the country from somewhere like Mexico, and they'll bring children with them that are maybe 1 or 2 years old at the time. 20 years later, it's found out that they're not legally U.S. citizens, and so at 20 years old, they get deported back to Mexico, but they have no memory of Mexico. All they've ever known is the United States, and they don't even speak Spanish. That is the exact same reason why many Jews did not go back to Judah. It made no sense to them. They knew nothing about it. It was not their home. Well, Esther takes place when King Ahasuerus becomes king, and he holds like a 6-month party followed by a 7-day dinner. And as the king and his guys are holding a party in one area of the palace, Queen Vashti, his wife, is holding another party for the ladies in a different part of the palace. Everyone's having a good old time until the king, who's been drinking heavily and is in good spirits, decides he wants to show off the beauty of the queen to all the guys, and so he has her summoned. Well, she's having none of this, and she refuses to go. And this makes the king embarrassed and angry. And he doesn't know what to do. So he asks his advisors, and they're like, hey, you need to nip this in the bud right away, because once word gets out that the queen disobeyed the king, then all of our wives will stop doing what we tell them to do as well. It will be a complete and utter disaster. So get rid of her and get a new queen, and which is what he does. The problem is it takes a long time to get a new queen. And so they gathered all the women throughout all the kingdom who fit the category, and they come and they try out for the job of the king's wife, or at least to be part of the king's harem of concubines. It just so happens that Esther, who is Jewish and has been raised by her uncle Mordecai, is caught up with these women who are being brought in. Now Mordecai instructs her not to tell anyone that she is a Jew, because they most likely would not have included her if they had known, and she won't get the queen's job. Mordecai seems to have some sort of plan here. Not only does Esther get included, but the king chooses her to be his wife. During this time, Mordecai has been hanging out outside the palace gates, keeping track of what's going on with Esther. While doing this, he uncovers a plot by some people to kill the king. He turns the guys in, thereby saving the king's life. Yes, this is going to play a big part in what happens later, so stay tuned. Now, after everything settles down, the king promotes one of his trusted advisors named Haman, and he makes him like the highest servant to the king in the land. And this makes Haman incredibly happy because, well, he knows now that everybody bows down before him and pays him homage, and he kind of enjoys this, right? Well, except for this one Jew named Mordecai who says, I only bow down before God. And this angers Haman to no end, and Haman is a very vengeful, spiteful man. And so he comes up with a plan not only to get rid of Mordecai, but all the other Jews in the land for that matter. He casts the pur, or the dice, and using that, he selects a day when all the people in Persia will be able to kill their neighbors who are Jews. If they kill them, they also get all their stuff as well. So there's a lot of incentive to do this. The king, not realizing that his wife is a Jew, signs off on this because, well, it makes sense to him. After Mordecai finds out about this, he goes to Esther and says, you have to do something about this. Go to the king and have him call this off. Esther is at first reluctant because even though she's the king's wife, you can't just show up and talk to him. Nobody, including the wife, can do that. If she goes into his presence without his request, it could mean death, unless the king extends his scepter to her. Mordecai tells her, well, maybe she was raised up for such a time as this. That, of course, is the most famous line in the book of Esther. And by the way, Mandisa, who recently died, wrote a great song about it too. Anyway, Esther agrees and goes in and talks to the king, but she doesn't come out and tell him the score. Instead, she asks that she be able to hold a big dinner for him and to invite Haman, which is pretty good guidance when dealing with some hot potato issues, right? Sometimes keeping it low and slow will get you further than the, bull in a china closet approach. When Haman finds out he's invited to dinner, he's very happy. And he goes to dinner, and Queen Esther requests that she be allowed to hold a second dinner, and Haman's also invited to that. Well, Haman's ecstatic, man. Everything seems to be going his way. But on the way home, he runs into Mordecai, who refuses to bow down to him again. He goes home and complains about this like a petulant child to his wife and friends, and they basically tell him, stop complaining and do something about it. Like, hang him. Haman says, that's a great idea. And he has gallows constructed to carry out the act. Meanwhile, back at the palace, the king can't sleep, and he has his attendant come in and read the court records to him. I guess that's a pretty good way to get put to sleep, right? But as the attendant is reading, he comes across a report about Mordecai turning in the would-be assassins. The king asks if Mordecai has ever been rewarded for that, and he is told no. Well, the next morning, Haman is all excited, shows up at the palace, and the king calls him in and asks, hey, what would you do if you were king and someone had done a great service for you? Yes, how would you reward him? Well, Haman thinks the king's talking about him and says, well, I would put the king's clothes on him, put him on a royal mount, and parade him through the town with someone proclaiming how great he is. The king says, oh, that's a great idea. Hey, do me a favor and do that for Mordecai. Haman's like, what? Hey, what? Didn't see that coming. So that's exactly what Haman has to do for Mordecai. That must have burned a lot. Not long after this, Haman shows up at the second dinner, and he's thinking, well, not a good start to the day, but the queen must be getting ready to honor me for something that I've done because she specifically requested me twice. So he's pretty happy. But much to his surprise, in the middle of the dinner, Esther reveals that she herself is a Jew and that Haman is trying to murder her people. The king is in shock, leaves the room to collect his thoughts. While he's gone, Haman realizes he's in deep trouble and goes to her pleading for his mercy. But in the process, accidentally falls into her lap just as the king is walking back into the room. Well, the king thinks that Haman's trying to put a move on his wife. He loses his temper and has Haman hung on the very gallows that Haman had built to hang Mordecai. Esther then pleads for the king to reverse his order and save her people. The problem is, according to the laws of the Medes and Persians, a king's rule cannot be undone even by the king. So he orders that all Jews be allowed to defend themselves, and they do, and they win the battles, and Mordecai is elevated to Haman's former position. This is the start of the Feast of Purim, which is still celebrated today by the Jews, the casting of the pur, or the dice. When Purim is celebrated, this story is read out loud, and whenever Mordecai's name is said, the people cheer, and whenever Haman's name is read, the people boo. That is the story of Esther, a beautiful story that doesn't even mention God once, but does show how God takes care of his people, using his people, well, to do it. Does something to us here today. And that leads us to the book of Job. Now, I'm not going to get into the background of that very deep today, because next week we'll really be getting into the meat of the book. And again, it's a great book too. Job is one of the first stories chronologically, not one of the first books, but one of the first stories of the Bible, coming right after the story of the Tower of Babel in Genesis 11. At least that's what most scholars say. So it's a very ancient story. It involves a man named Job who was very faithful to God and lived a very righteous life. God had blessed him for this, and he's very wealthy and respected in the community. He's so pious, he makes sacrifices for his children all the time, just in case they sin in some way. The story starts off with a very weird encounter between God and Satan. God actually asks Satan what he's been doing. And Satan says, well, going to and fro from the earth, kind of hanging out. And God then tempts Satan with his follower Job. And Satan says, look, the guy's only faithful to you because you take care of him. If you take away everything he values, he will curse you to his face. God says, you think so? All right, he's all yours, but just don't kill him. So Satan makes it so Job loses everything, his children, his cattle, his house, all his wealth, but Job remains faithful to God. And so God and Satan have yet another encounter, and Satan says, well, if you take away his health, he will curse you. So again, God says, go for it, but just don't kill him. So Job's skin is covered in boils, and he's absolutely miserable. But Job still does not curse God. Now that would be an interesting story in itself, but then Job's 3 friends show up to comfort him. And for many days, they do that by just sitting there and saying absolutely nothing. They're just there with him. The problem starts when they open their mouths and start talking. And let's just say it goes downhill from there. Job is a book about suffering and how God allows us to suffer and even brings suffering into our lives to increase our faith and reliance upon him and mature us. Next week, we'll get more into that suffering and how this interaction between Job and his friends teaches us how to deal with other people's sufferings and what to say and, more importantly, what not to say, and also how to deal with our own suffering and some of the bonehead things people say to us when we're going through it. Well, that's it for this week. Next week, we'll be covering Job 11 through Job 34. Thank you for joining us for The Road to Jesus with Pastor Fred here at St. James Lutheran Church in Marion, Indiana. And peace out, and we'll see you next week.